Welcome to Decoding Cultural Layers, where stories turn into insights and everyday life unfolds in unexpected ways. I'm Gafdilius. Let's peel back the layers together. When you hear the word slavery, what comes to mind? Chains, whips, or a dark chapter of history that we like to believe is already closed? But what if slavery is not just a cruelty of the past? What if it never disappeared, only changed its form? In this episode, we will look at slavery beyond textbook definitions, from war and captivity to why large economic systems came to depend on it, from the way religion, philosophy and language helped legitimize it, and most importantly, to whether freedom truly arrived when the chains were broken. There are no good versus evil fairy tales here, and there are no comforting answers, but you will find this: an exploration of one of humanity's longest-lasting, most persistent, and most normalized traps. If you're ready, let's take a closer look at slavery. What is slavery? In its broadest sense, slavery is the ability of one human being to force another human being to work, to compel them into service. It is a practice that has appeared in many different forms throughout history and has been remarkably widespread. Rather than thinking about this as an abstract concept, let's consider a concrete example. Imagine a person who wants to leave where they are and travel to another country, or even another continent. There are significant costs involved: transportation, accommodation, passage fees. Someone else covers these costs. In return, a long-term service relationship is established. On paper, this may look like a contractual labour arrangement, but in practice, if the person has no freedom of movement and no real alternatives, this arrangement begins to resemble slavery very closely. Many people today think of slavery as something that is banned, something that belongs entirely to the past. Yet historically, slavery has never simply disappeared. It has constantly changed its form. Sometimes it appears as chains, sometimes as debt, sometimes as contracts, sometimes as control over documents and movement. To understand this transformation, we also need to look at how words and concepts evolve. In some societies, words that once meant service or dependence gradually came to mean slave. As practices change, language adapts. And every society produces its own form of slavery, shaped by its economic and political structures. So how did slavery first emerge? One of its most fundamental sources is tribal raids and warfare. When a community is defeated, there are several options. People can be killed, released, or taken captive. Captives can be eliminated quickly, but they can also be put to work. It is at this point that slavery, as a system, begins to take shape. This is not only a matter of violence, it is also a matter of need. The expansion of agriculture, the growth of cities, the construction of large-scale projects, all of these create a constant demand for labour. As pressure on land increases and production expands, societies develop more complex structures: laws, taxation systems, divisions of labour, social classes. Slavery becomes one of the functional tools within these complex arrangements. That is why slavery appears in ancient legal codes. The issue is not simply brutality, it is how the system is organised and maintained. When we come to the present day, the question becomes: has slavery really ended? In form, perhaps. In practice, not entirely. Today, we still see situations where migrant workers have their passports confiscated, where their ability to leave is effectively blocked, where their rights exist on paper but are suppressed in reality. If we define slavery only through chains and whips, we miss these realities. Slavery is connected to any system that effectively locks a person's ability to move and their range of choices. In the past, mobility was already extremely limited. City gates were closed, travel was dangerous, expensive and slow. Today, movement has accelerated. But alongside this acceleration, new systems of control have emerged. passports, identification systems, border regimes. Movement becomes faster, yet simultaneously more regulated and monitored. One of the mental frameworks that sustain systems of slavery is the idea that some people are inferior. This idea usually draws from two main sources. The first is the tendency to use the same word for foreigner and slave, automatically placing the outsider in a lower position. The second is dehumanization. When someone is treated as less than human, actions that would otherwise be unthinkable become easier to justify. Language lowers the threshold for cruelty. Traces of these justifications can be found in religion and philosophy as well. Some interpretations speak of cursed lineages, others propose the idea of the natural slave. Still others claim that some people are created to rule, while others are created to work. The notion that all humans are equal has not been dominant for most of history. It is a concept that gained strength relatively late in the modern world. However, an important distinction must be made here. Not every system of slavery is structured in the same way, and not all are organized primarily around race. In some societies, slavery appears mainly in domestic service, court life, or military structures. In others, it becomes the driving force of large-scale agricultural economies. The routes through which slaves are acquired also vary, according to geography and economic needs. In this context, slave-soldier systems are particularly striking. Slaves are transformed into professional armies. In some regimes, this military class grows so powerful that it eventually seizes political control. This shows that slavery is not limited to physical labour in fields. It can also function as a mechanism within state and power structures. In the American case, slavery develops alongside large plantation economies. Cotton production in particular sits at the centre of this system. The Industrial Revolution creates an enormous demand for cotton almost overnight. When demand explodes, production must increase rapidly. But agriculture has its own rhythm. It cannot simply be commanded to produce 10 times more. At this point, state power, credit systems, and coercive regulations come into play. As new lands are opened, large plantations expand, and slave labour becomes central to this growth. The resulting conflicts are not merely moral debates, they are economic, political, and institutional struggles. Different models of production and different visions of society come into direct conflict. This raises a crucial question. If monotheistic religions place such value on human life, how did slavery become so deeply internalized? Religious texts may contain principles of compassion, equality, and emancipation. But in practice, economic benefits, political needs, and entrenched habits often outweigh these ideals. Human beings are remarkably skilled at finding interpretations that legitimize their own interests. In the ancient world, relationships of obedience were widespread, within families, feudal systems, and patronage networks. Slavery represents the harshest link in this chain of obedience. And the ideologies that defend slavery tend to share two common elements. The first is culture, language and habits that normalize keeping those deemed inferior in a lower position. The second is paternalism, the claim of doing this for your own good. Violence is repackaged as protection. Even when slavery is abolished, everything does not immediately improve. In the short term, societies may experience massive disruption, displacement, and economic chaos. Interpreting this chaos as evidence that slavery was actually beneficial is itself another form of manipulation. As the idea of human value gains strength in the modern era, slavery becomes harder to defend openly. But this does not mean that coercion disappears. States develop more indirect methods of managing populations, education systems, disciplinary regimes, labour structures, health policies. Oppression changes its form, it does not vanish. Even after slavery is formally abolished, legal and de facto systems of discrimination can persist for decades. This shows that solving a problem on paper does not mean it has ended in everyday life. Language softens, terms change, but institutions and daily practices may remain intact. Societies cannot absolve themselves simply by saying, "We are not racist." The human mind can fear the unfamiliar and perceive difference as a threat. The real question is how these tendencies are constrained, through which institutions, which laws, and which public arrangements. Living together is not an abstract moral lesson, it is a concrete, constructed order. The idea of race itself is a historical construct. The desire to classify people into tables and hierarchies based on appearance expanded the foundations of modern racism. These classifications, often presented as scientific, are in fact products of political and economic interests. The claim that slavery is more economically efficient is also highly questionable. In the short term, forced labour may generate output, but in the long term, slave labour imposes serious limitations on skill development, motivation, innovation, and productivity. People who are coerced resist in subtle ways. They work slowly, damage tools, sabotage systems. The system must be sustained through constant pressure and violence, which carries its own costs. Some rights are granted and later taken back. Others remain purely symbolic. Activism, social struggle, and political crises disrupt these systems, but local power structures, institutional resistance, and entrenched habits slow down real change. Democracy is a slow-moving system. At its best, it produces restraint. At its worst, paralysis. Ultimately, slavery, racism, and similar systems are traps. They erode human dignity, corrode the moral foundations of society, and normalize violence. What demands attention is not only the chains of the past, but the invisible locks of the present.